Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Anabelas by the band Bubu.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Luckily, this Argentinian band didn't choose a more complicated name to pronounce in their native language because Anabelas is actually a pretty nice name, and the name for a band Bubu, well, I don't know, kinda childish I guess, but I guess it's a fine name. But anyway, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So, of course, the origins of progressive rock can be traced back to the UK in the very late 60s and throughout the 70s as its prime time of materializing as its own subgenre of music. Now, if there's one thing that we all know is that prog wasn't an overnight success kind of deal, and for many regions of the world it took a while before the progressive scene actually reached them. Second and third world country are prime candidates of regions in the world where progressive rock didn't really materialize only until like the mid 70s, and I'm of course talking about regions of Asia, Africa, and even South America. And don't even get me started on the Antarctican prog album that we're all still waiting for. But in 1975, in the land of Alpha Horus, a new band that has just formed would go on to create one of the most unique South American prog albums of all time, and the band's name is of course Bubu, and this is their first album, Anabelas. Now, up until 2016, this band only had one release, and that was this album that we're reviewing today. But as I said, in 2016, a new formation of this band was created, and they were spearheaded by the original composer of Anabelas called Daniele Andreoli, and he went on to compose and even play the bass on Anabelas' second album that came out a mere 40 years after their first one, and that one is actually an EP and it's called Resplendor. I feel like I should integrate some of the Argentinian accent into it, so I'm actually gonna pronounce it Resplendor. But in 2019, the band actually took a leap of faith and stopped working with Daniele Andreoli and actually created their own original album. Now, this is an entirely new incarnation of the band, and we're not gonna talk about them. I don't know these albums from the 2000s, but today we're just gonna talk about their original album from 1975. So this album consists of only 3 tracks, with the first side containing one very long piece that takes the entirety of that side, and the second side containing 2 shorter tracks. The first and grandest piece on this album to be found on side 1 is called Procession of a Yellow Day, and this one, well, it kind of defied my expectations for what this album was going to sound like. And the ways I could describe what this specific song sounds like is what you'd get if you timed Crimson by Frank Zappa by Magma and mashed them all together, or in another sense if you just took the most absurd parts of Aria's music and just stretched them out to be one singular giant piece. Or another way of looking at this, and that's a callback for yesterday's episode, this feels like some sort of a very very unhinged Anglo-good. But putting the similes aside, this track and this entire album consists of mainly 6 main instruments, each one being played by a different member of the band. So of course we have the guitars, we have the bass, and also the keyboards and the drums, and the 2, let's say, special instruments on here are the violin and the flute. All of them make a very strong appearance on this first track, with none of them really sticking out more than the other. Usually when it comes to these large ensembles, you have 1 or 2 instruments that seem to pop out of the rest, but in this case it really does seem like everyone is doing their part and pretty much doing so equally. And this first song, it is very much highly chaotic, and to me at least it felt like the band were trying to somewhat restrain this chaos from going any further than it is, making some small advances but also seeing a lot of regressions that creates a song that both features a lot of calm sections alongside a lot of hard sections, all of them pretty much constantly shifting from one to the other, never really stopping by and really focusing for a long term on each individual one of them. Now I feel like this is the point of the video where I should mention that this album, if you're gonna listen to it or if you have listened it, is not really quite a good representation of Argentinian prog. It is quite an anomaly in the scene itself, and if you want to get to know something which is much more native, you can go ahead and listen to bands like Crucis or even Espiritu. Now the second side for this album consists of 2 tracks that in their essence feel like the first track, but they're quite different. And I think that I pinpointed these differences down into the following anecdotes. Firstly, these songs are more lyrically driven, featuring many more lyrics, which probably have a big significance on the meanings of the songs, but I did not go ahead to translate any of them. Secondly, I do find that these 2 songs are more melodically driven rather than the first song, which is definitely more reliant on its rhythm section. And thirdly, these 2 songs seem to take a much more contemporary approach to their song structures. Now while that would normally be a bad thing, I personally found it to be pretty much nice, and you can definitely see all of that on the second track on this album called Anabelas Journey. This one to me at least felt like a much more concise and very compromising version of the first track, which is easier for me to digest. Now if I didn't mention this one by now, this album isn't really easy to digest on a first listen. Even me, that I've listened to so many albums in such a short span of time, this album was definitely a lot to take in, and especially the first track when it comes down to it. Now this second track, it is definitely my favorite from this album, and the third track and last track on this album called Mannequin Dreams is also pretty much similar to the second track, but somehow I just find it to be slightly less exhilarating and much more forgettable than the 2 others. But for anyone here who hasn't yet dabbled in South American prog, I highly suggest you go ahead and check out this album, and of course go ahead and check out the Pois du Film by Macomarchi if you haven't. That's an amazing album that came out of Brazil, so if you don't know that one, you know what, go ahead and check that. I know that this isn't the video about it, we've already done an episode about that one, but it's just a really good album. And for anyone who really likes Italian prog, go ahead and check out today's album. It really does have a lot of similarities to some Italian prog, and I'm sure that all of you Italian prog fans would love this one as well. So I am well aware that there is no one singular correct way to create a progressive rock album cover, but at the same time this cover just kind of feels off to me. It doesn't feel like something that you'd see on a progressive rock album cover. It isn't bad per se, I just don't really find it that appealing, and it really throws me off in some sense. I can only assume that the fine lady found on this cover has to be the titled Anabella, and she seems pretty relaxed and she seems like she's having a pretty good time chilling over there, and that's probably a subject that's expanded upon in the lyrics mainly of the second track, but I didn't bother to translate, so I do not know. But again, there's nothing really bad about this cover, at least not inherently, but I just don't really find it all that much enjoyable to look at. But you might disagree with me on that, and that's totally fine. But usually when it comes down to it, you guys watching this channel usually disagree with me on the musical part, and the cover part, you just take whatever I say. So yeah, it's not a good cover, I don't really like it, and you know what, live with it. So All in all, this album is a fine album but nothing too shabby, and it's gonna get a pretty good rating of 7 out of 10. But that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Cressida by Cressida, their debut album. I'm very excited for that, so hopefully it will be a good one. I also want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Walnum and Wrist of Kings, you are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.